Another major context that he talks about is cultural studies as a radical contextuality. He talks about the importance of context in cultural studies and in establishing culture. So he says that cultural studies assumes that meaning is always shaped by relationships and interactions. No idea, event, or cultural phenomenon exists in isolation. It is always defined by its connections. Change is constant and contexts are always shifting. So cultural studies focuses on something that is not permanent, something that is always changing, and this change is what he calls as the context. He says that the context based on which cultural formations happen, cultural studies is based on, it is not something static. It keeps changing and it is never in isolation. If you talk about something, a particular event or a particular incident, what led to that particular incident, all the other things happening as a part of that incident is also affecting the culture. So that is never in isolation. There is always a relationship and interactions happening, kind of like a chain reaction. Then he says that cultural studies is not tied to any single theoretical tradition but engages with Marxism, post-structuralism, feminism, critical theory, critical race theory, queer theory, and more. So when we look at let's say feminism, the changes that are happening in feminism can also affect post-structuralism, can also affect Marxism, can also affect race theory. So it is not independent. Cultural studies is not independent, but it is connected to all these forms. Then he says that cultural studies engages in both deconstruction and reconstruction. So it is not simply it is not simply trying to understand the hidden structures of power, also trying to bring out new possibilities as well. Another major idea that he presents is how cultural studies is far away from essentialism. When we talk about essentialism, they always try to associate everything is essential. All the ideas are already established, the existing structures are fixed, they are inevitable. But cultural studies rejects this. Cultural studies tries to accept the change and focuses on change that happens every day. According to cultural studies, what we see is that nothing is static, everything is subject to change. Cultural studies does not focus on isolated events or text. Instead, it examines structured assemblages of practices, a very important term that keeps recurring in this essay. These formations exist within larger social, institutional, and political structures. No event or text can be studied separately from the context that shapes and constitutes it. When we talk about structured assemblages, what we mean here is that, think of any practice, let's say a marriage that is happening. Now when you look at a marriage function, it is associated with many different things. It can be based on a religious belief, it can be based on a family belief, it can be based on the location in which it is happening. So there are so many other assemblages that contribute to this event. So that is what cultural studies is like. It is not an isolation, but there are many different assemblages to it. Often in traditional academic studies, context is treated as a mere background. So let's say a text, when we look at let's say the text Macbeth, which was written, or Hamlet, whatever it is, when we look at that particular text, we understand the story, we understand whatever is happening. But then there is the political situations that happen during the time in which Shakespeare was writing. Shakespeare's own personal interest also matters when we try to analyze the text. So these kind of contexts are very much important in cultural studies. In earlier academic studies, traditional academic studies, this was simply considered as background. It is not important. But in cultural context, cultural studies, the context is very much relevant. Another major point he talks about is the need for continuous reconstruction of context. This is what we talked about in the case of essentialism. Nothing is permanent according to cultural studies. everything keeps changing, keeps evolving. Something that we might have accepted as culture, let's say 5 or 10 years back, might not be accepted today or tomorrow. It can keep changing, it can keep evolving over time. So there is a continuous reconstruction happening in cultural studies. And something else he points out is how culture and power is interconnected, interrelated. He says that cultural studies sees power as a complex, multifaceted force that cannot be easily reduced to singular categories like gender, class, or sexuality. Rather than viewing power in simple terms of domination and resistance, it understands power as operating across multiple axes. So he is trying to talk about the intersectionality, how power and culture is interrelated. When we understand, let's say in terms of class, when we are trying to understand the power structure over there, it also gives us an understanding of the power structure that happens in the issues related to gender or issues related to sexuality. So everything is interconnected. And like I mentioned earlier, what cultural studies is trying to do is break these power structures as well, indirectly, because if a new culture has to come into existence, the existing power structures are to be eliminated. That is also something that cultural studies engages in. Power is not a static force but is always subjected to contradictions, and there are fissures within power that offer possibilities for struggles and transformation. Fissures mean gaps, and here there is a possibility in these power when there is, let's say, like it is mentioned, it is not static. In certain cases, there is an opportunity for struggle, there is an opportunity to establish a newer power or a newer culture. That is also something cultural studies involves in. It also focuses on how power influences daily life, infiltrating personal experiences and practices, shaping the possibilities people have to live dignified and just lives. Therefore, to understand and change power dynamics, cultural studies emphasizes the importance of starting with people's lived experience and context rather than assuming universal or abstract theories. So like I mentioned, power dynamics, in order to understand and bring about change in the power dynamics, cultural studies also gives importance to the lived experiences and context of individuals. The next idea presented through this essay is theorizing context. So here what Lawrence Grossberg is trying to say is that the idea associated with context, we already talked about context, how it is never in isolation, how it is not fixed, how it keeps changing over time, it is an assemblage of practices, all these things we talked about. So he continues with the similar discussion and says that it constantly changes based on relationships, places, and social interactions. So he's completely focusing on context, and he's saying that context keeps changing in relation with the other factors. And he gives us a very important example is that of location and locality. When you think of location, it's a mere place, but when you think of locality, it is it has many stories associated with it, the historical importance of it, the cultural implications, the people who reside there. So all these factors are what defines locality, whereas location is a mere place. So the context keeps changing here, the context varies over here. And he says that in order to understand this context in a better way, he introduces three modalities. He says that in order to have a better understanding of how context is structured or experienced or transformed, we have to understand the three modalities. The first one is milia, the second one is territory, and the third one is ontological epoch. So he says that milia, which is location, it's a physical space. Let's say a physical space. For example, we are talking about a park or a classroom. That is a physical space. Then we have territory, which is the place. When we talk about place, It is, let's say, how connections, relationships are born. For example, in a park, the people in the neighborhood come and sit together, talk, meet. So there is a new relationship that is built over there. So this talks about in a space how relationships are built. That is what territory is. Then talking about ontological epoch, it is a diagram. For example, when you take the park, let's say the park, the milia or the territory in context of a park, how over time it changes, how over time, based on human necessity, the perception of it keeps changing. The idea associated with it, the understanding of this keeps changing. So, that is what ontological epoch is all about. So, what the author is trying to say is that when you look at these three categories, these three modes of understanding, let's say context, you figure out that how in each case the context is very much different. Moving on to the conclusion, what Lawrence Grossberg is trying to say is that cultural studies does not adhere to a specific method in the traditional sense. Instead, it relies on a process of articulation, which we already talked about. How cultural studies does not focus on anything that is static, but newer ways of articulation. Like over the period of time, we talked about epoch, over the period of time, how based on necessity the culture changes. All these are taken into consideration in cultural studies. Cultural studies is about articulating the conjuncture, the specific set of relations and struggles that shape a particular context. This is done through assemblage and contextualization. We already saw how cultural studies is based on context. How cultural studies changes based on the context, and how the context can change based on material conditions, lived experiences, or historical structures. And then another thing that he points out is that cultural studies remains a project of critical engagement, continuously questioning, analyzing, and seeking new ways to make sense of the world and its struggles. When we started off with the essay, I did mention how through this writing, through this theoretical discussion, what he is trying to establish is how cultural studies is something that is trending in the 20th century, now even in the 21st century. But what is really cultural studies? What is cultural studies really trying to do? It is not simply analyzing culture or traditions, it is far beyond that. That is what he mentioned in the introduction. And continuing with that explanation here, he is saying that what cultural studies is trying to do is talk about critical engagements, continuously questioning and analyzing, and trying to figure out how the world performs, functions, and trying to realize how power structures are established and deconstructed. So these are few arguments that he is trying to make through this essay.